Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a forgotten, and frankly, disturbing chapter of history. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's the year 1550, and you're a 12-year-old boy living a simple life in a quiet Bulgarian village. The morning mist still clings to the valleys, and the gentle jingle of sheep bells is the only soundtrack you've ever known. Your mother's making breakfast, the comforting smell of warm bread and goat's milk filling the air. Life is peaceful, safe, predictable. But then, the ground begins to tremble. A distant thunder of hooves grows louder, closer. Your father's face pales, and your mother drops the clay pitcher she's holding, watching it shatter like your world is about to. Everyone in the village knows what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's collectors have arrived. You press yourself behind a wooden cart, watching Ottoman officials dismount, their silk robes pristine, their eyes scanning the terrified villagers with the cold calculation of merchants assessing livestock. Then, one of them points directly at you. Your mother collapses, pleading in a language they don't bother to understand. Your father stands silent, knowing that resistance means death for your entire family. You're torn away with empty promises that you'll serve the Sultan, that you'll rise to greatness, that this is an honor. But as the cart rolls away from everything you've ever known, all you can hear are your mother's sobs fading into the distance. You will never see her again. This was the brutal beginning of your new life as a palace boy, a Gaul within the most powerful empire on earth. And the horrors that awaited you behind those palace walls would make you long for those simple days watching sheep in the misty valleys of your homeland. The journey to Istanbul wasn't a pilgrimage. It was your first taste of systematic cruelty. You and dozens of other boys, some even younger than you, were marched for weeks across rugged, unforgiving terrain. There was barely enough food, and certainly no comfort. You slept in the open or in crude shelters that offered little protection from the biting winds or the pouring rain. The weak ones, those who couldn't keep up, who fell ill, or who simply gave up hope, were left behind to die. You learned your first brutal lesson of Ottoman palace life long before you ever reached the capital. Weakness was death. Only the strongest, the cleverest, or the most adaptable would survive what was to come. You remember the boy walking beside you, maybe 14 years old, taken from a Greek fishing village. His name was Nikos, though he whispered that soon even that name would be forbidden. He tried to escape on the third night of the march, slipping away into the darkness, but the guards caught him before he'd made it a mile. They dragged him back to camp and beat him in front of all the other boys. A chilling lesson for every single one of you. His screams echoed across the countryside, and you squeezed your eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But you couldn't block out the lesson. Escape was impossible. Resistance was futile. By the time you reached the outskirts of Istanbul, you had learned to move like a ghost, to speak only when spoken to make yourself invisible when the guard's attention turned predatory. You had watched boys simply disappear in the night, some who tried to run, others who just couldn't endure another day. Their empty spaces in the lines served as constant, grim reminders of your own mortality. The first sight of Istanbul's skyline should have been breathtaking. The minarets piercing the sky, the massive dome of Hagia Sophia, the sprawling palace complex that would become your prison. But all you felt was a hollow dread settling in your stomach like a stone. This magnificent city represented everything you had lost and everything you feared you would become. Upon arrival in Istanbul, you faced your first selection. Ottoman officials divided the surviving boys into groups based on their perceived potential. The process was humiliating and incredibly thorough. They examined your teeth like you were a horse, tested your reflexes, and made you recite what little you knew of letters and numbers. They even measured your height, scrutinized your skin for blemishes, and evaluated your facial features with the cold, clinical detachment of art appraisers. The most beautiful and intelligent among you were destined for the palace school, the Enderun. Others would become janissaries, the elite military corps known as the Sultan's shock troops. But for those chosen for palace service, a different kind of trial awaited. One that would test not just your body's endurance, but your very soul's ability to survive systematic dehumanization. You were among the fortunate ones selected for the Enderun school. housed within the formidable walls of Topkapi Palace. The officials who made this choice looked at your clear skin, your bright eyes, and your obvious intelligence, and they smiled. You didn't understand then that their smiles weren't kind. They were the smiles of predators who had found particularly promising prey. The Enderun School has often been called the world's first institutionalized education for the gifted. While that description is technically accurate, it completely obscures the darker reality of what education truly meant for displaced boys like you. Yes, you would learn languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. You would study mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law. You would be trained in music, calligraphy, and various crafts. But this education came at a price that extended far beyond mere academic rigor. The palace complex that became your world was a maze of marble corridors, ornate chambers, and hidden passages where danger lurked around every corner. You were housed in dormitories within the palace complex, separated from the outside world by layers of walls, guards, and protocol that made escape not just difficult, but unthinkable. The Enderun was less a school and more a gilded cage. Your first night in the Enderun dormitory, you lay awake, listening to the chilling soundtrack of your imprisonment, the soft sobbing of homesick boys, whispered conversations in unfamiliar languages, and the creeping footsteps of older students and supervisors. You clutched the small wooden cross your mother had pressed into your hand, but by morning, that last tangible connection to your former life would be confiscated. You were given a new name, Mehmet, and told to forget your Christian origins. Conversion to the empire's official faith wasn't optional. It was fundamental to your transformation from a captured child into an Ottoman servant. The ceremony was conducted with great pomp, as if you'd chosen this path. But you knew, and everyone knew. Choice had nothing to do with it. You repeated the words, but inside, you clung to the memory of your mother's lullabies. However, the most insidious aspect of your education was the systematic breaking down of your individual will and your reconstruction as an instrument of imperial pleasure and power. The palace operated on a complex hierarchy where advancement depended not just on academic achievement, but on your ability to please superiors. And pleasing could take many forms that no child should ever have to learn. However, the most insidious aspect of your education was the systematic breaking down of your individual will and your reconstruction as an instrument of imperial pleasure and power. The palace operated on a complex hierarchy where advancement depended not just on academic achievement, but on your ability to please superiors. And pleasing could take many forms that no child should ever have to learn. Your first lesson in the palace's unspoken rules came from Amit, an older student who'd been in the system for 3 years. He approached you one evening, his voice carrying both threat and promise. "You're new," he said, settling onto the edge of your bed. "You don't understand how things work here yet, but I can protect you, teach you, help you advance. The teachers favor me, and they listen to my recommendations about the younger boys." He let his hand rest on your shoulder, and you felt yourself freeze. You were 12 years old and had never been touched by a stranger in such a way, but something in his manner made your skin crawl. "In return," he continued, dropping his voice to a whisper, "you would need to show your gratitude. There are ways that boys like you can thank older students for their protection, special ways that stay between us." You faced an impossible choice: refuse and risk brutal punishment, social isolation, and the end of any hope for advancement, or accept and surrender the last vestiges of your childhood innocence. There was no good choice, only survival. The palace's sexual ecosystem was complex and predatory. Eunuchs, castrated as boys themselves, wielded considerable power and used it to exploit new arrivals. Older students preyed on younger ones, perpetuating cycles of abuse. Palace officials took advantage of their positions to access the most beautiful boys with impunity, knowing their victims had no recourse. What made this system particularly insidious was its integration with the palace's official hierarchy. Sexual relationships weren't hidden scandals. They were part of a social order. Boys who caught the eye of powerful patrons could find their careers accelerated, while those who refused simply disappeared from the palace rolls. The psychological impact on boys like you was devastating and carefully calculated. Cut off from your family, stripped of your original identity, and thrust into a world where your body was seen as a commodity. You inevitably developed what we might now recognize as complex trauma responses. Some boys, in a desperate bid for self-preservation, became manipulative and calculating, learning to use their sexuality as a tool for advancement and survival. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming hollow shells who went through the motions of palace life while their spirits died inside. You watched both transformations happen to boys around you. There was Dmitri, taken from the same region as you. Within 6 months, he learned to smile and flirt with the older students and teachers. He gained new clothes, better food, and even a private tutor for his language studies. But his eyes had gone dead, and he no longer spoke of home or family. When new boys arrived, he looked at them with the same calculating gaze the officials had once turned on him. Then there was Stefanos, a Greek boy who had been a fisherman's son. He took the opposite path. He refused all advances, endured beatings and punishment, and gradually faded into a ghost-like existence. He performed his duties mechanically, studied adequately but without enthusiasm, and seemed to disappear a little more each day. One morning, his bed was empty, and no one ever mentioned his name again. You tried to find a middle path, accepting some advances to survive while maintaining some core of yourself that remained untouched. But the palace was designed to make such compromise impossible. Every day brought new tests, new choices between degradation and destruction, new ways the system sought to remake you in its own image. Even European travelers who visited the Ottoman court occasionally glimpsed this hidden world, though their accounts were often filtered through their own cultural biases and limited understanding. A 16th century Venetian ambassador, for instance, noted the excessive fondness that palace officials showed for their young male servants, describing scenes that made him uncomfortable in the extreme. He wrote of seeing boys as young as 10 or 11 dressed in silk and jewels, attending to older men with a familiarity that suggested relationships far beyond appropriate master-servant dynamics. A French diplomat in the 17th century wrote more explicitly about what he witnessed during a palace reception. The young pages moved through the halls like beautiful birds in cages, their eyes downcast, but their bodies adorned for display. One cannot help but notice the possessive manner in which certain officials regard these children, nor the fear that flickers in the boys' eyes when their masters approach. These fragmented glimpses hint at the pervasive, unspoken reality of the palace system. The physical conditions of palace life compounded the psychological abuse in ways that were designed to break down any last vestiges of resistance and create absolute dependency. You lived in cramped dormitories with minimal privacy, where every moment was subject to surveillance and control. You were awakened before dawn for prayers you'd been forced to learn, fed adequate but not abundant meals at precise times, and subjected to a rigid schedule that left absolutely no time for reflection or, more importantly, resistance. Punishments were common and often creatively designed to humiliate and break spirits. Boys who violated rules, speaking their native languages, practicing old traditions, or showing insufficient enthusiasm for their new lives, faced beatings, public humiliation, or isolation in chambers barely large enough to lie down in. You witnessed a boy named Milos, caught praying in the manner of his former faith, forced to stand naked in the courtyard for an entire day while other students were encouraged to mock him. The lesson was stark and clear. Your old identity was not just forbidden, it was a source of profound shame. The palace's internal economy further complicated your situation and created additional layers of exploitation. You could earn small privileges through good behavior, academic achievement, or by pleasing your superiors in various ways. These privileges, better food, nicer clothing, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, access to books or musical instruments, became precious commodities in your restricted world. This system created a complex web of dependencies and loyalties that made resistance nearly impossible and collaboration seem like the only path to survival. You learned to navigate this economy with the calculating mind of someone much older than your years. You discovered that helping older students with their studies could earn you protection from their advances. You found that showing particular aptitude in certain subjects could gain you the attention of teachers who might shield you from the worst abuses. and you quickly realized that perfect obedience and visible enthusiasm for your new life could result in small freedoms that felt enormous in your circumscribed world. Every small concession, every minor comfort, served to reinforce your reliance on the system that simultaneously abused and sustained you. Some boys, driven to desperation, attempted escape, but the palace's location on a peninsula, largely surrounded by water, made this incredibly difficult. The golden horn shimmered temptingly, yet it was a formidable barrier. Those who were caught faced severe punishment, designed to be deliberately public to deter any others contemplating such a futile act. You witnessed the return of a boy who had tried to flee by swimming across the golden horn. He was barely alive when they dragged him back, a broken, shivering mess. The beating he received in front of all the students left him permanently injured, a stark, living warning to the rest of you. He lived, barely functional, a grim example of what happened to those who chose rebellion over submission. His shattered body was a constant, haunting reminder that the palace had an inescapable grip. Even the few boys who miraculously managed to flee faced an even more daunting challenge. What next? They had been in the palace so long, their original identities so thoroughly erased, that returning to their former lives was impossible. Their families might not recognize them, or worse, their communities might reject them as traitors or converts. They possessed few, if any, skills that would allow them to survive outside the palace system. Most who escaped were recaptured within days, often found wandering disoriented in the bustling streets of Istanbul, a city they knew nothing of beyond the palace walls. But even those who remained free often found themselves adrift in a world that no longer had a place for them, caught between a past they couldn't reclaim and a future they couldn't build. Their freedom was a different kind of prison, a lonely existence in a world that had forgotten them. As you climbed the ranks within the palace, you faced a stark, horrifying truth. Success came at the cost of your very soul's corruption. The most accomplished students, like you, could eventually secure high government positions as viziers, generals, or governors. But this ascent demanded a profound sacrifice, embracing the system that had brutally shaped you. You realized with growing dread that your teachers and supervisors, the men who had molded and marred you, were once boys just like you. Many chose to become the system's enforcers rather than remain its victims, finding it easier to be the predator than endlessly the prey. The Sigma, your graduation ceremony, marked the official end of your palace education and your entry into the Empire service. After years of systematic abuse disguised as learning, you emerged a capable young man, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in administration and diplomacy. Yet, you also carried deep psychological scars. Your understanding of power was forever entwined with exploitation, and your capacity for normal human relationships was damaged, perhaps irreparably. For many, this transition simply meant moving from one form of exploitation to another, with lessons of power and submission continuing to dictate their adult lives. The Ottoman elite's attitude towards these practices was complex. While official rules seemingly prohibited many abuses, palace authorities largely ignored behaviors that served their interests. The system successfully produced loyal, capable administrators, its primary objective. The immense human cost was simply deemed irrelevant to its success, and any outside criticism was dismissed as ignorance of the empire's sophisticated methods. An anonymous 16th century historian wrote of the great sacrifices demanded by the palace school, claiming it produced the finest servants of the empire. This rhetoric of transformation neatly masked the reality. Your testing involved systematic abuse, your discipline the destruction of your identity, and your learning came at the price of your childhood innocence. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the palace system began to decline. Changes in military technology reduced the janissary's importance, and new administrative forms lessened a reliance on palace-trained bureaucrats. European influence and shifting social attitudes also contributed to its gradual transformation. But for the thousands of boys who passed through those gates during its height, these changes came far too late. Their stories of childhood lost, innocence destroyed, and spirits broken in service to imperial power represent one of history's most chilling examples of institutional child abuse. Today, the very palace walls that once echoed with the footsteps of these boys still stand. Topkapi Palace has been transformed into a museum, a grand showcase where millions of tourists annually marvel at its architectural splendor and artistic treasures. Visitors admire the beautiful chambers where the empire's elite were educated, but they see only the physical beauty of the spaces. The marble corridors keep their darkest secrets, and the ornate rooms where education and exploitation intertwined remain silent about the unfathomable price that generations of young boys paid for imperial glory. The guided tours speak of the palace school's educational innovations, its pivotal role in training capable administrators, and its undeniable contribution to the empire's success. Yet, they almost universally omit any mention of the systematic abuse that was fundamental to its operation: the daily degradation, the psychological torment, the outright violence. They don't speak of the boys who chose death over submission, or the men who emerged from its opulent halls forever changed, their spirits indelibly scarred by their experiences within its walls. This remains a forgotten story, conveniently swept under the rug of historical grandeur. As I conclude this account, imagining your story as representative of thousands like it, I'm profoundly reminded that these tales of suffering and survival are not merely historical curiosities. They represent real human beings, children torn from their families, stripped of their identities, and forced to navigate a world that valued their bodies and minds while dismissing their humanity as utterly irrelevant to the empire's grand designs. Your ghost, the boy I've imagined standing in those marble corridors with fear in your heart and silence on your lips, represents thousands of real children whose names we will never know, whose individual stories were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged by the system that created and sustained it. Your story and the stories of all the boys like you still haunt those palace halls. They serve as a chilling reminder that behind every empire's grandeur lies a foundation built on human suffering. The price of power is often paid by those who have no choice in the matter. The true horror wasn't just in the violence itself, but in how systematically it was applied, how completely it was normalized, and how thoroughly it has been forgotten by history. These stories need to be remembered, not as exotic historical footnotes, but as powerful testimonies to human resilience in the face of institutionalized cruelty. The morning air that once carried your fearful footsteps has long since faded, but your story echoes still through time, demanding that we bear witness to your suffering and remember the terrible price of the empire's golden age. In remembering your story, we honor not just your individual suffering, but the suffering of all children who have been caught in the machinery of power throughout history, used and discarded by systems that value conquest over compassion, empire over innocence.